Chapter 1. Strange Message. In a Novel. The morning sun cast long shadows through the lace curtains of Danemead as Miss Jane Marple poured herself a second cup of tea. She peered out at the high street, where a small crowd had gathered outside the premises that had stood empty for nearly 3 years. Today, at last, St. Mary Mead would have its bookshop back. The open book, she murmured to herself, reading the freshly painted sign. How appropriate. Setting down her cup, Miss Marple collected her hat and shopping basket. A proper bookshop in the village again. What delightful news. She had always maintained that a village without a bookshop was like a garden without roses. Functional, perhaps, but lacking in essential beauty. The bell above the door tinkled cheerfully as she entered. The scent of new paint mingled with the unmistakable aroma of books, that particular combination of paper, ink, and possibility that always made her feel quite at home. Shelves, stretched from floor to ceiling, their contents arranged with evident care and attention. "Welcome to the open book." A man emerged from behind the counter, tall and well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to London life. "James Harrington, at your service." "Miss Marple," she replied, inclining her head. "How wonderful to have a bookshop in the village again. We've missed it terribly." "Indeed, I understand the previous establishment closed rather suddenly." "Poor Mr. Bradley's health, you know. These things happen." Miss Marple's eyes had already begun scanning the shelves. "I see you have a splendid selection." "Including an extensive collection of detective fiction," Mr. Harrington said, gesturing toward a well-stocked section. "I'm told it's particularly popular in these parts." Miss Marple smiled. "We do enjoy our mysteries in St. Mary Mead. One might say we have a certain affinity for them." Her fingers traced along the spines until they paused at a familiar title. "The Murder at the Vicarage," by Agatha Christie, a second-hand copy, its dust jacket slightly worn but intact. How fitting, she thought, to find this particular book on opening day. "Ah, excellent choice," Mr. Harrington said. "One of the classics." "Indeed, I believe I shall take it." The transaction completed, Miss Marple made her way home, the book nestled in her basket alongside her morning purchases. After lunch, she settled into her favorite armchair, the autumn sunlight warming her shoulders as she opened the cover. It was as she turned to the first chapter that she noticed something peculiar. Certain words throughout the text had been underlined in faint pencil, so faint that in lesser light they might have gone unnoticed entirely. Her keen eyes narrowed as she studied the markings. They seemed random at first. Help on page 7, Trapped on page 12, Blackwood on page 18. Curiosity thoroughly piqued, Miss Marple fetched a piece of paper and began noting down each underlined word in sequence. It took her the better part of an hour, moving through the pages with methodical care, until she had compiled them all. Help trapped Blackwood Manor, danger not accident. She read the message twice, then a third time. Her memory, sharp as ever despite her years, immediately conjured an image of Blackwood Manor, that imposing Georgian house on the outskirts of the village, its windows dark these many years. "Not accident," she repeated softly. Rising from her chair, she examined the book more carefully. There, on the inside back cover, she found what she had half expected, a small notation in the same careful hand. E.H. 1962, followed by what appeared to be a telephone number, though time had rendered several digits illegible. Miss Marple remembered that year with perfect clarity. Sir Richard Blackwood's tragic fall from the upper floor of the manor. The funeral, attended by half the county. The whispers that had circulated afterward, dying away, as whispers do when there's nothing to feed them. She reached for her telephone, dialing the partial number more in hope than expectation. The line was dead, disconnected long ago. Still holding the receiver, she considered her options. The obvious course would be to dismiss the whole thing as someone's idea of a game. A treasure hunt, perhaps, or a child's make-believe. Yet something about the careful precision of those pencil marks suggested otherwise. That evening, Colonel Bantry called round for their weekly game of piquet. Over the cards, Miss Marple broached the subject casually. "I was thinking about Blackwood Manor today," she said, arranging her hand. "Such a beautiful house. Rather a shame it's stood empty so long." The Colonel grunted. "Heard it's been sold at last. Some publishing outfit from London, planning to restore it, apparently." "Indeed. How interesting. I suppose they'll want to lay the old ghosts to rest." "Ghosts?" The Colonel looked up from his cards. "You mean Richard's death? Nasty business, that. Though I never did hold with all the talk afterward." "Talk?" "Oh, you know how people are. Some folk couldn't accept it was just an accident. Richard had been acting strangely in the weeks before, they said. Secretive. Worried about something." He shrugged. "But then, he always was an odd fish. Brilliant man, mind you, but odd." "I remember he was working on a book," Miss Marple said carefully. "His memoirs, yes. Never finished, of course. Shame, really. Would have been fascinating. He knew everyone in the literary world." They played on in companionable silence, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. After the Colonel had gone, she sat for a long while in her drawing-room, the mysterious book open on her lap. Outside, the wind whispered through the autumn leaves, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The next morning brought unexpected news. Miss Marple had just finished breakfast when Miss Weatherby arrived, breathless with the latest village information. "My dear Jane, have you heard? The new bookshop, broken into last night. Mr. Harrington is quite beside himself." "Good gracious," Miss Marple said, though inwardly she felt a chill of premonition. "Was much taken?" "That's the strange thing. Only some boxes of old books, second-hand ones he hadn't even unpacked yet. Nothing valuable, apparently. The police are there now." After Miss Weatherby departed, Miss Marple put on her hat with determined precision. The break-in at the open book might be coincidence, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to distrust coincidences. They were, in her experience, usually nothing of the sort. As she walked toward the high street, the message from the book echoed in her mind. "Help trapped Blackwood Manor. Danger not accident." Someone, it seemed, was still crying out from the past, and Miss Marple, who had never been able to ignore a cry for help, was already beginning to suspect that the events of 1962 were about to cast a very long shadow indeed over the present day. Chapter 2. The New Bookshop Owner. The open book presented a scene of controlled disorder when Miss Marple arrived. Books lay scattered across the floor near the back entrance, and Mr. Harrington stood amid the chaos, directing a young man who was attempting to restore order to the displaced volumes. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, straightening as she entered. "Come to view the aftermath of our little drama." "I do hope the damage wasn't too severe," she replied, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "More puzzling than damaging, I'm afraid." Harrington gestured toward the scattered books. "They were after these boxes of second-hand books I'd bought from the Weatherby estate sale last month. Haven't even had time to catalogue them properly." "How very odd," Miss Marple said. "One would think thieves would target the cash register or your first editions." Precisely what Inspector Slack said. Harrington's tone suggested he found the inspector's presence more trying than the burglary itself. He's in the back room now, examining the forced window? Miss Marple produced her copy of The Murder at the Vicarage from her basket. I wonder, Mr. Harrington, if I might ask you about this book I purchased yesterday. Is there a problem with it? Not exactly, but I noticed something rather curious. She opened the book, showing him one of the faintly marked pages. These pencil underlinings, they appear throughout the text. Harrington took the book, examining it with what seemed to Miss Marple to be exaggerated casualness. How peculiar. Some reader's notation system, perhaps? Or a student marking passages for an essay? He smiled, handing it back. I'm afraid the history of second-hand books is often a mystery in itself. Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly, though this particular mystery spells out quite a specific message when the words are read in sequence. A flicker of something, surprise, concern, crossed Harrington's features before his expression smoothed into polite interest. Really? How fascinating. What sort of message? Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Slack emerged from the back room, notebook in hand. Mr. Harrington, I'll need a complete list of what was in those boxes. I've already explained, Inspector, I hadn't inventoried them yet. Most irregular, Slack grumbled, running a business without proper records. I've only been open one day, Harrington pointed out with barely concealed irritation. Miss Marple, observing this exchange, allowed her gaze to wander around the shop. It settled on a framed photograph on the counter, a group of people at what appeared to be a literary gathering. The photo looked to be from the early 1960s, judging by the clothing and hairstyles. What a lovely photograph, she remarked. Is that you in the center, Mr. Harrington? You look very young. He glanced at the picture. Yes, from my early days in publishing. A book launch party, I believe. Miss Marple peered closer. Why, I do believe that's Sir Richard Blackwood on the right. I didn't realize you knew him. The publishing world was smaller then, Harrington said smoothly. One tended to know everyone, at least by sight. Of course. Miss Marple's tone was perfectly pleasant, but her mind was working rapidly. Mr. Harrington had failed to mention this connection when she'd purchased the book yesterday, the very book that contained a message about Blackwood Manor. Inspector Slack, having finished his preliminary investigation, departed with promises to return once Harrington had compiled whatever information he could about the stolen books. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple turned back to the proprietor. You mentioned you came to St. Mary Mead for the quiet life. After London, it must seem very different. Refreshingly so, Harrington replied, though something in his manner suggested he was eager for her to leave. The pace of city publishing can be overwhelming. I imagine so, and yet you've chosen to settle so close to Blackwood Manor. Quite a coincidence, considering your acquaintance with Sir Richard. Is it? His smile didn't reach his eyes. I wasn't aware the manor was particularly significant to the village. Oh, it's been much in people's minds lately, what with the sale to that London publisher. Thornfield, I believe? This time there was no mistaking Harrington's reaction. His hands, rearranging books on the counter, stilled momentarily. You're remarkably well informed, Miss Marple. Village life, she said apologetically. News travels fast in St. Mary Mead. After leaving the bookshop, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where she knew she would find Miss Weatherby sorting the morning mail. As expected, her friend was bursting with information. Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard about that Mr. Harrington. Mrs. Bantry's maid told my daily that he's been asking all sorts of questions about Blackwood Manor. Wanted to know about the layout of the grounds, the old staff, even about poor Sir Richard's accident. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And that's not all. He's been to the church, looking through the parish records. The vicar mentioned it to me just this morning, said he was particularly interested in 1962. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. I don't suppose you remember Sir Richard's secretary, Eleanor Hargreaves? Miss Weatherby's face brightened. Of course, quiet woman, very efficient. Left the village right after Sir Richard died. Very sudden it was, too. There was talk she'd gone to America, but no one knew for certain. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to her solicitor, Mr. Petherick. After discussing some matters regarding her modest investments, she steered the conversation toward local history. I've been thinking about notable residents of St. Mary Mead, she said. Sir Richard Blackwood, for instance. You handled his estate, didn't you? Petherick, a cautious man by nature, considered his response carefully. I dealt with some aspects of it, yes, though much of it was managed by his London solicitors. His death was such a shock to the village, and then his secretary leaving so abruptly. Miss Hargreaves, yes. A very capable woman. I believe she was quite devoted to Sir Richard and his work. His memoir, you mean? Petherick shifted slightly in his chair. Among other projects, Sir Richard was always writing something, though I understand the memoir was never found after his death. Never found? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. How curious. One would think a manuscript would be among his papers. One would think so, yes. Petherick's tone suggested he had wondered about this himself. But then, the circumstances were unusual. That evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple examined her small collection of books purchased from the original village bookshop years ago. Her intuition proved correct. In a volume of Tennyson's poetry, she found similar faint pencil markings. When decoded, they revealed another message. Richard knew about manuscript, must protect it. She sat back in her chair, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a pattern in her mind. Sir Richard Blackwood had known something worth protecting, worth hiding. His secretary had fled after his death, but not before leaving these cryptic messages in books throughout the village. And now, decades later, James Harrington had arrived in St. Mary Mead, showing particular interest in Blackwood Manor, while claiming to seek a quiet retirement. The break-in at the bookshop took on new significance. Someone else was searching for Eleanor Hargreaves's messages, but who? And what secret had been worth killing for in 1962 that still demanded protection today? Miss Marple rose and drew her curtains against the darkening evening. Through the gap, she could just make out the lights of the open book, where James Harrington was apparently working late. As she watched, another figure approached the shop, a woman in a dark coat who paused at the door before being admitted. Even from this distance, Miss Marple recognized the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. This, she suspected, might be someone from Thornfield Publishing. The plot, as they say in detective novels, was thickening. She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, her needles clicking in steady rhythm as her mind worked through the possibilities. Sir Richard's lost manuscript, Eleanor Hargreaves's flight, James Harrington's arrival, and now this mysterious visitor. All threads in a tapestry of deception that had begun to unravel with a simple message hidden in a second-hand book. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to old Mrs. Bantry at the Hall. If anyone would remember the details of village life in 1962, it would be Dolly Bantry. And Miss Marple had a feeling that those details might prove very illuminating indeed. As she prepared for bed, she paused by her bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. How many more messages might be hidden in these pages? How many more cries for help from the past, waiting to be discovered? The wind rattled her window panes, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Miss Marple smiled grimly to herself. The game, as someone once wrote, was most definitely afoot. Chapter 3. Missing First Editions. Mrs. Bantry received Miss Marple in her morning room, where sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the gardens of Gossington Hall. The years had been kind to Dolly Bantry, though she now lived alone in the vast house, Colonel Bantry having passed away some years before. "Jane, how lovely! I've just had the most interesting news from Arthur. You know how he still keeps up with his military connections." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of tea. "Well, apparently there's been quite a stir about Blackwood Manor. The Thornfield publishing people have been making inquiries about Sir Richard's book collection. Seems they expected to find all sorts of valuable first editions when they took possession, but the library was virtually empty." Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care. "How curious. I understood Sir Richard had quite an extensive collection." "Oh, he did. Arthur remembers being shown some remarkable volumes, signed Dickens, first edition Brontes, even a Shakespeare folio, though that might have been family exaggeration." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward confidentially. The official story was that everything was sold to pay death duties, but Arthur never believed it. "Why not?" "Because he was executor of the estate, along with those London lawyers. He says there was never any proper inventory of the library, just a vague statement about private sales and discretionary dispersal, most irregular. And what became of these books? That's just it. Nobody knows. They simply vanished. Arthur always suspected something wasn't right, but with Sir Richard dead and Miss Hargreaves gone, there was no one to ask." Later that morning, Miss Marple noticed a new announcement in the open books window. "Special exhibition, rare first editions, preview evening Friday." The timing struck her as remarkably convenient. Inside, she found Mr. Harrington arranging books in a glass display case with reverential care. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to see our treasures?" "I couldn't resist. First editions have such character, don't you think?" "Indeed. I've been fortunate to acquire several remarkable pieces." He gestured to the display. A first edition Pride and Prejudice, signed Wilkie Collins, even a Hemingway with a personal inscription. Miss Marple examined the books with interest. "My goodness! Wherever did you find such treasures?" "Various sources. Estate sales, private collectors. One develops contacts over the years." His smile was practiced, professional. "The preview evening should be quite special. I'm expecting several collectors from London." "Including representatives from Thornfield Publishing?" The smile faltered slightly. "As a matter of fact, yes. Victoria Thornfield herself is coming down. Professional courtesy, you understand?" That evening, Miss Marple attended the preview, arriving early enough to secure a good vantage point. The shop was crowded with villagers and visitors from London, all eager to view the collection. She noticed Harrington's increased nervousness as the hour approached, his eyes frequently darting to the door. Victoria Thornfield arrived precisely at 7, a striking woman in her 30s with an air of quiet authority. Her handshake with Harrington was firm, professional, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension. "Mr. Harrington, what a fascinating collection you've assembled." "Miss Thornfield, I'm honored you could attend." They moved toward the display case, and Miss Marple positioned herself close enough to observe their interaction. As Victoria examined each book, Her expression remained carefully neutral, but her hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly when she picked up a leather-bound volume of Byron's poetry. "This particular edition," she said quietly, "has quite distinctive binding. Italian leather, if I'm not mistaken." "You have an excellent eye," Harrington replied, though he seemed increasingly uncomfortable. "My father was something of an expert on bindings. He had a similar volume in his collection once." She paused meaningfully. "As did Sir Richard Blackwood, I believe." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Harrington's reply, when it came, was carefully measured. "Books do circulate among collectors. Provenance can be difficult to establish definitively." Miss Marple, examining a nearby volume, had made her own discovery. Several of the books bore faint marks where book plates had been removed, marks that, to her experienced eye, suggested hasty rather than careful work. In one volume, tucked behind the end paper, she found a tiny fragment of what had clearly been a book plate, showing just the edge of what looked like a family crest. "Excuse me?" she said mildly, "but isn't this part of the Blackwood family crest?" Both Harrington and Victoria turned sharply. Harrington's composure cracked for a moment before he recovered. "I'm sure you're mistaken, Miss Marple. These books come from various sources." "Of course," she replied pleasantly. "How silly of me, though it does bear a striking resemblance to the crest at Blackwood Manor." Victoria Thornfield's interest sharpened. "May I see?" Miss Marple showed her the fragment. Victoria studied it intently, then looked at Harrington with barely concealed triumph. "This is indeed the Blackwood crest. How interesting that such a book should appear in your collection, Mr. Harrington." "Pure coincidence, I assure you?" "Perhaps, though I wonder what Sir Richard's estate inventory might reveal about his missing first editions." The tension between them was palpable. Other guests, sensing the atmosphere, began to drift away from their corner of the room. Miss Marple, however, remained close enough to hear Victoria's next words, spoken in an undertone. "We need to talk. Privately." "I don't think that's necessary." "I disagree. Unless you'd prefer I discuss my suspicions with the police." Harrington's face paled. "Tomorrow morning. The shop will be closed." After the event, Miss Marple lingered in the high street, ostensibly window shopping but actually observing the open book. Her patience was rewarded when, an hour after closing, she saw Harrington and Victoria through the illuminated shop window, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. Victoria gestured repeatedly toward the display case, while Harrington shook his head emphatically. Walking her nephew's dog later that evening, a convenient excuse for surveillance, Miss Marple passed the shop again. The argument had intensified. She couldn't hear words, but Victoria was holding one of the first editions, pointing to something inside the cover. Harrington attempted to take the book from her, and in the brief struggle that followed, several volumes tumbled from the display. The next morning brought a new development. Miss Marple found an envelope pushed under her door, containing a single sheet of paper. The message, written in the same careful hand as the book annotations, read, "The manuscript is the key. Trust no one from Thornfield. The truth about the theft must come out. E.H." So Eleanor Hargreaves was not only alive, but aware of current events in St. Mary Mead. More significantly, she felt compelled to warn Miss Marple about Thornfield Publishing. But why? If Victoria Thornfield was investigating the missing first editions, wouldn't she be an ally in uncovering the truth? Unless, Miss Marple reflected, there was more to the Thornfield connection than mere professional interest. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's words about Sir Richard's collection and the mysterious circumstances of its disappearance. What if the books now gracing Harrington's display case were indeed from Blackwood Manor? And what if their reappearance threatened to expose not just a theft, but something far more serious? That afternoon, she encountered Victoria Thornfield walking near the church. The younger woman appeared preoccupied, almost distressed. "Miss Thornfield? I hope you're enjoying your stay in St. Mary Mead." Victoria started, then managed a smile. "Miss Marple. Yes, it's quite charming. I couldn't help noticing your interest in our local history last night. The Blackwood collection must be of particular significance to a publisher." Sir Richard was an important figure in literary circles. His library was legendary. Victoria hesitated, then added, "My father knew him quite well." "Indeed? Mr. Geoffrey Thornfield, isn't it? The author?" "Yes." Victoria's expression clouded. Though perhaps "knew" is too strong a word, they had professional dealings. And now Thornfield Publishing owns Blackwood Manor. How things come full circle. Victoria studied her for a moment. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple. Perhaps more than you realize." She glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "I think there are things about my father's connection to Sir Richard that I'm only beginning to understand. Things that Mr. Harrington would prefer remained buried." Before Miss Marple could respond, Victoria excused herself hastily, walking quickly toward the high street. Watching her go, Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of pattern recognition, pieces of a puzzle sliding toward their inevitable configuration. That evening, she made careful notes of everything she had learned. Sir Richard's death in 1962, his missing manuscript, the vanished first editions, Eleanor Hargreaves's flight and cryptic messages, James Harrington's arrival in St. Mary Mead, the Thornfield Publishing connection, and now, the reappearance of books bearing traces of the Blackwood crest. The picture forming was dark indeed, but one crucial piece remained missing: the manuscript itself. Eleanor's note had called it the key. The key to what? And why was its discovery so important that someone had felt compelled to silence Sir Richard permanently all those years ago? As Miss Marple prepared for bed, she heard the distant sound of a car engine. Looking out, she saw lights at Blackwood Manor, unusual at this hour. Whatever secrets the old house held, someone was determined to uncover them. Or perhaps, she thought grimly, to ensure they remained hidden forever. Chapter 4. The Author's Visit. The announcement appeared in the open book's window on Tuesday morning. Special event: Margaret Rutherford, best-selling mystery author. Book signing, Saturday 3 p.m. Miss Marple paused in her morning walk to study the poster, which featured the photograph of an elegant woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Death in Little Mead," she read aloud, examining the book cover displayed below the author's photo. "A village mystery where nothing is quite as it seems. Remarkable resemblance to St. Mary Mead, wouldn't you say?" observed Dr. Haydock, who had stopped beside her. "I read an advance copy. The fictional village even has a nosy elderly lady who solves crimes." "How interesting," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I shall have to attend." Inside the shop, she found Mr. Harrington on the telephone, his voice tense. "Yes, I understand she's arriving Friday. No, I haven't found anything else. The signing should provide good cover for a thorough search." He noticed Miss Marple and ended the call abruptly. "Ah, Miss Marple. Looking forward to our literary event?" "Indeed. Miss Rutherford must be quite famous to draw such attention." "One of our most successful mystery authors," Harrington confirmed, though he seemed distracted. "She worked in publishing before turning to writing, knows everyone in the business." "Including yourself, I imagine?" We were at the same firm years ago, before she discovered her talent for fiction. He paused. She knew Sir Richard Blackwood as well, edited one of his early works. This revelation intrigued Miss Marple. How fascinating! I suppose the literary world was even smaller then. Quite incestuous, really. Everyone knew everyone else's secrets. Harrington caught himself. Professional secrets, naturally. Publishing contracts, that sort of thing. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mr. Petherick's office on the pretext of updating her will. After their business concluded, she steered the conversation to Blackwood Manor. "I've been thinking about Sir Richard's unfinished memoir," she said casually. "Such a shame it was never found." Petherick shifted uncomfortably. Yes, well, there were many things about that estate that were never properly resolved. Oh, I probably shouldn't say, but Sir Richard had been quite agitated in the weeks before his death. He came to me asking about libel laws, of all things. Wanted to know how much proof one needed before making serious accusations in print. What sort of accusations? He wouldn't specify, just said his memoir would shake the foundations of the literary establishment. Rather melodramatic, I thought, but he was quite serious. Even talked about needing protection. Protection from whom? He didn't say, but he did mention that if anything happened to him, Eleanor Hargreaves would know where to find the evidence. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. And Miss Hargreaves left immediately after his death. Within days, most irregular. She didn't even collect her final wages. Later, while taking tea with Miss Weatherby, Miss Marple learned more about Eleanor Hargreaves's departure. "Oh yes, I remember it clearly," Miss Weatherby said. "She was staying at the Bluebell Inn those last few days, seeing to funeral arrangements and such. Then one morning she was simply gone, paid her bill and vanished. The maid said she'd been up all night, writing letters. Letters to whom? No one knows, but she posted a whole stack at the village post office before catching the early train to London." That evening, Miss Marple retrieved her copy of The Murder at the Vicarage, and studied Eleanor's coded message again. On impulse, she examined the pattern of marked words more carefully, noting their positions on each page. When she plotted these positions on graph paper, they seemed to form a rough diagram. Working late into the night, she compared this diagram to her memory of Blackwood Manor's layout. The pattern appeared to indicate the library, specifically an area near the fireplace. Could Eleanor have hidden something there before fleeing? The next morning brought increased activity at Blackwood Manor. Construction vehicles arrived early, and Miss Marple observed several workers carrying equipment into the house. Walking past the gates with feigned casualness, she noticed Victoria Thornfield directing operations, with particular attention being paid to the library wing. That afternoon, she encountered Mrs. Bunner, who had served as housekeeper at Blackwood Manor during Sir Richard's time. "Terrible mess they're making up there," Mrs. Bunner complained. "That Miss Thornfield has them pulling the library apart. Books everywhere, panels off the walls. Looking for dry rot, she says. But I maintained that library for 20 years, and there was never any rot. They're removing the wall panels. Every blessed one. Even had them examining the fireplace. Sir Richard would be horrified. He was very particular about that room. I suppose he spent a great deal of time there, working on his memoir. Day and night, those last months. He and Miss Hargreaves typing away. Sometimes I'd hear him reading passages aloud. Angry, he sounded. Once I heard him say something about thieves in respectable clothing and reputations built on stolen words. Made no sense to me. As the week progressed, preparations for the author event intensified. Publishers' representatives arrived from London, local hotels filled with literary enthusiasts, and the open book became the centre of village activity. Miss Marple noticed that several of the visiting professionals seemed particularly interested in the shop's collection of first editions. On Friday afternoon, Margaret Rutherford arrived in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple observed her checking into the Bluebell Inn, the same establishment where Eleanor Hargreaves had spent her final nights in the village. The author was a handsome woman in her 50s, with an air of quiet authority that reminded Miss Marple of a headmistress at a particularly exclusive school. That evening, a small reception was held at the open book. Miss Marple attended, watching as Harrington and Rutherford greeted each other with the polite distance of former colleagues who shared complicated history. "James," Rutherford said coolly. "Still collecting other people's treasures, I see." "Margaret, still turning other people's secrets into fiction." Their exchange, though civil on the surface, crackled with unspoken tension. Victoria Thornfield, also present, observed their interaction with keen interest. During the reception, Miss Marple managed a private moment with the author. "I'm very much looking forward to your talk tomorrow, Miss Rutherford. I understand you once worked with Sir Richard Blackwood." The author's expression shifted subtly. Briefly, he was a complicated man, brilliant, but perhaps too interested in other people's failings. His memoir would have been fascinating. Would it? Sometimes the past is best left undisturbed, don't you think? "That depends," Miss Marple replied carefully, "on whether the past insists on disturbing the present." Rutherford studied her sharply. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple, and you're very careful with your words, which I'd expect from an author of your caliber. In my profession, one learns that words can be weapons. Richard never understood that. He thought truth was its own justification." "And you disagree?" "I think truth without context can be cruel. Richard was preparing to destroy reputations, careers, lives, all for the sake of his precious honesty." "Or perhaps for justice?" Rutherford's smile was enigmatic. "Justice is a luxury not everyone can afford, Miss Marple." Saturday's event drew an enormous crowd. The shop was packed with admirers eager to hear Rutherford discuss her latest mystery. During her talk, she made several references to the importance of secrets in village life and how the most respectable citizens often had the most to hide. Miss Marple, seated near the back, observed the reactions of key players. Harrington appeared increasingly nervous, while Victoria Thornfield took copious notes. Several times, Rutherford's gaze swept the crowd, as if searching for someone specific. During the question period, an elderly woman in the back row raised her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly despite its softness. "In your books, the guilty often escape justice for years before truth catches up with them. Do you believe real-life murders can remain hidden for decades?" The question seemed to electrify the room. Harrington went rigid, Victoria leaned forward intently, and Rutherford paused before answering. "I believe," the author said carefully, "that secrets have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right. Murder will out, as they say." "Even when powerful people are involved?" "Especially then. Power built on lies is inherently unstable." Miss Marple turned to look at the questioner and felt a jolt of recognition. Despite the passage of years, despite the grey hair and lined face, she knew those intelligent eyes, that determined set of the chin. Eleanor Hargreaves had returned to St. Mary Mead. The signing that followed was a blur of activity, but Miss Marple noticed that both Harrington and Victoria appeared deeply unsettled. Eleanor, having asked her pointed question, had slipped away in the crowd. That evening, as the village settled back into its routine, Miss Marple sat in her garden, piecing together the day's revelations. Eleanor's return, timed to coincide with Rutherford's visit, was no coincidence. The author's carefully worded responses suggested she knew more about Sir Richard's death than she admitted, and the tension between all parties pointed to secrets that had festered for decades. The stage was set, Miss Marple reflected, for a final act in a drama that had begun with a murder in 1962. The question now was not who had killed Sir Richard Blackwood, that was becoming increasingly clear, but whether justice delayed could still be justice served. As darkness fell, she noticed lights burning late at the Open Book, Blackwood Manor, and the Bluebell Inn. Tomorrow, she suspected, would bring the convergence of all these separate threads. The truth, as Margaret Rutherford had said, had a way of revealing itself when the time was right. And Miss Marple had a feeling that time was very near indeed. Chapter 5. Hidden Clues in Literature. Sunday morning found Miss Marple preparing her sitting room for a visitor. She had sent a carefully worded note to the Bluebell Inn the previous evening. Mrs. Hartley, I believe we have mutual friends from 1962. Tea at Danemead, 11 o'clock? The reply had come within the hour. With pleasure. E.H. Eleanor Hargreaves arrived precisely at 11, her grey hair neatly pinned, her manner cautious but determined. In daylight, Miss Marple could see more clearly the woman who had once been Sir Richard's trusted secretary. Intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, hands that still bore faint ink stains from years of typing. Miss Marple, she said, settling into the offered chair. I wondered if anyone would decipher my messages. They were quite ingeniously hidden, though I suspect you hoped someone would find them eventually. I hoped, yes, but I never dared return myself until I heard about the bookshop and Mr. Harrington. When I learned that he was here, selling books from Sir Richard's collection, I knew the time had come. Miss Marple poured the tea. Perhaps you should start at the beginning. Eleanor accepted her cup with steady hands. The beginning was Sir Richard's discovery. You see, he had been collecting evidence for years, not just for his memoir, but for something he called his insurance policy. He knew secrets about the publishing world that would have destroyed reputations. What sort of secrets? Plagiarism on a massive scale. Sir Richard discovered that Geoffrey Thornfield, yes, Victoria's father, had built his entire career on stolen manuscripts. Young writers would submit their novels to Thornfield's publishing house. The best ones would be rejected officially, but Geoffrey would rewrite them slightly and publish them under his own name. Surely someone would have noticed. The original authors were unknowns, often from remote places or difficult circumstances. Who would believe them against the great Geoffrey Thornfield? Besides, the manuscripts were altered just enough to make direct comparison difficult. Sir Richard only discovered it because he recognized his own unpublished novel, one he'd submitted years ago, repackaged as Thornfield's breakthrough success. Miss Marple set down her teacup. And Sir Richard's memoir would have exposed this. Everything. He had documented evidence, marked up manuscripts, correspondence, even confessions from some of Thornfield's associates. James Harrington was Geoffrey's editor and chief accomplice. They made a fortune together. Which explains why Sir Richard had to die. Eleanor nodded grimly. That last week, Sir Richard received several threatening phone calls. Geoffrey and James visited the manor, supposedly to negotiate. Sir Richard refused to be silenced. That evening, she paused, composing herself. I was in the garden when I heard the argument upstairs, shouting, then a crash. I ran inside, but they were already coming down the stairs, claiming Sir Richard had fallen accidentally. You didn't challenge them? I was terrified. They knew I'd been helping with the memoir. James actually smiled at me and said, "Accidents happen to secretaries too." I fled that night. But not before hiding the evidence. I spent hours that night hiding everything. The manuscript went behind the library fireplace. There's a concealed compartment Sir Richard had shown me. The most damaging first editions, the ones with marginalia proving the plagiarism, I scattered throughout the village, marking passages in other books to create a trail back to the truth. Very clever. But why not go to the police? With what proof? 2 respected men of letters against a secretary. Besides, they threatened my family. So I disappeared, changed my name, moved to Canada. But I kept watching, waiting. When Geoffrey Thornfield died last year, I thought perhaps it was finally safe. Then I learned about Victoria purchasing Blackwood Manor and James opening a bookshop here. They're looking for the manuscript, aren't they? I believe so. Victoria seems to have discovered her father's crimes and wants to suppress the evidence. James wants to protect himself. Eleanor reached into her handbag and produced a small canister. I wasn't entirely truthful in my messages, Miss Marple. I didn't just hide the manuscript. I photographed key pages first. Microfilm was still common then. This canister contains enough evidence to expose everything. Have you shown this to anyone else? Not yet. I wanted to be sure it would reach the right hands, but there's something else you should know. Margaret Rutherford. She was involved too. The author. She was Geoffrey's reader at the publishing house. She knew about the stolen manuscripts but kept quiet in exchange for her own publishing contract. Her first novel? It was actually written by a young teacher from Yorkshire who died before she could protest the theft. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. So, when Rutherford saw you at the signing, she recognized me immediately. I could see the fear in her eyes. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an urgent telephone call from Colonel Bantry. "Jane, have you heard? There's been some sort of confrontation at Blackwood Manor. Victoria Thornfield and that bookshop fellow, having a blazing row in the library. The workmen didn't know what to do, so they called the police." Miss Marple didn't hesitate. "I'll be right there." She collected Eleanor, and together they hurried to Blackwood Manor. They arrived to find Inspector Slack's car in the drive and raised voices echoing from the library windows. Inside, they discovered Victoria Thornfield and James Harrington facing each other across a demolished fireplace. Workers had partially dismantled the stonework and scattered papers littered the floor. "You knew it was here all along," Victoria accused. "I knew it existed. I've been searching for it as long as you have," Harrington retorted. Inspector Slack looked bewildered. "Now then, what's all this about?" Before either could answer, Eleanor stepped forward. "It's about murder, Inspector. Murder and theft on a grand scale." Harrington's face went ashen. "Eleanor, you're alive. Did you think you'd frightened me to death?" "No, James. I've been waiting for the right moment to return." Victoria looked between them, confusion evident. "I don't understand. Who is this woman?" "This," Miss Marple interjected quietly, "is Eleanor Hargreaves, Sir Richard Blackwood's secretary. She witnessed his murder in 1962. Murder. Slack's attention sharpened. The death was ruled accidental. "Many things appear accidental when powerful people arrange them," Eleanor said. She moved toward the fireplace. "May I, Inspector?" At his nod, she reached into the partially dismantled structure and manipulated a hidden catch. A section of stonework swung open, revealing a cavity behind. Inside lay a leather portfolio, dusty but intact. "Sir Richard's memoir," she announced. "The complete truth about Geoffrey Thornfield's plagiarism empire." Victoria sank into a chair. "So it's true. My father really did steal from desperate writers? Build his reputation on others' work? Have his critic murdered?" "Yes, all true." Eleanor's voice was steady but bitter. "Your father and James killed Sir Richard when he threatened to expose them." Harrington attempted to edge toward the door, but Slack moved to block him. "I think you'd better stay put, sir. This is sounding very interesting indeed." Eleanor opened the portfolio, revealing pages covered in Sir Richard's distinctive handwriting. "It's all here. The original manuscripts, the altered versions, correspondence proving the conspiracy. Even a chapter about the night they came to negotiate with Sir Richard." "You can't prove anything," Harrington said desperately. "It's been over 60 years. Any evidence is circumstantial at best." "Is it?" Eleanor produced her microfilm canister. "I have photographs of documents that were later destroyed. Letters in your handwriting, James, discussing how to handle the Blackwood problem, including one dated the day before Sir Richard died, mentioning that permanent solutions may be necessary." Victoria stood slowly. "I came here to protect my father's reputation, but not at the cost of justice." She turned to Inspector Slack. "My father's private papers are in London. I found references to disposing of evidence after Sir Richard's death. I'll make everything available to the police." Well, said Slack, looking somewhat overwhelmed. "This is quite a turn-up, Mr. Harrington. I think you'd better come with me to the station. We'll need to have a very long chat." As Harrington was led away, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple. "Thank you. Without your deciphering those messages, none of this would have come to light." "The messages were meant to be found," Miss Marple replied. "Truth has a way of surfacing, even after decades of silence." "What happens now?" Victoria asked. "Now," said Eleanor, "we restore credit to the real authors. Some may be dead, but their families deserve to know the truth. Their words deserve recognition." "And Rutherford?" Victoria inquired. "Margaret Rutherford has her own conscience to wrestle with," Miss Marple observed, "though I suspect she'll find it expedient to cooperate with any investigation, given the circumstances." As they left Blackwood Manor, the afternoon sun illuminated the library where so much had been hidden for so long. Eleanor paused at the doorway, looking back. Sir Richard always said that books contain more than just stories. They hold truth, justice, sometimes even redemption. And, occasionally, Miss Marple added with a slight smile, they contain the solutions to murders, though it may take a patient reader to discover them. That evening, as news of the day's revelations spread through St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her garden, reflecting on the power of the written word. Books had indeed proven to be more than mere entertainment. They had been witnesses to a crime, carriers of coded justice, and finally, instruments of truth. The case would make headlines, she knew. The literary world would be shaken by the scandal. But justice, though delayed by decades, had finally been served. And somewhere, perhaps, Sir Richard Blackwood could rest easy, knowing his final chapter had been written at last. Chapter 6, Mystery Solved. 3 days after the dramatic discoveries at Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple hosted a gathering in her cottage drawing-room. The morning light streamed through her windows as she arranged chairs for her expected guests. Inspector Slack, Colonel Bantry, Eleanor Hargreaves, Victoria Thornfield, and, under police supervision, James Harrington. "I appreciate you all coming," Miss Marple began once everyone was settled. Inspector Slack has kindly permitted this meeting to clarify certain aspects of the case before formal charges are filed. Slack nodded gruffly. Miss Marple has been instrumental in uncovering this complicated affair. I thought it proper she explain her deductions. Indeed, Colonel Bantry added. Though I must say, Jane, I'm still rather confused about the whole business. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps it's best to start at the beginning, not 1962, but several years earlier, when Geoffrey Thornfield discovered a remarkably efficient method of becoming a celebrated author without the inconvenience of actually writing. Victoria winced, but remained silent as Miss Marple continued. Geoffrey Thornfield ran a small publishing house that attracted submissions from aspiring writers across the country. With the help of his editor, James Harrington, he identified the most promising manuscripts. These would be officially rejected, devastating their hopeful authors. Then Geoffrey would rewrite them, changing names, locations, and minor plot points before publishing them under his own name. The perfect crime, Eleanor interjected bitterly. Who would believe an unknown writer claiming the great Geoffrey Thornfield had stolen their work? Precisely. The scheme worked flawlessly for years. Geoffrey became famous and wealthy while the true authors remained in obscurity. Some gave up writing entirely. Others, tragically, never lived to see their work in print at all. Miss Marple turned to James Harrington, who sat rigid in his chair. You were more than just an accomplice, weren't you, Mr. Harrington? You were the architect of the system. You identified which manuscripts to steal, helped Geoffrey alter them just enough to avoid detection, and handled any complications that arose. Harrington's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but he waved the man away. What's the point in denying it now? Yes, I helped Geoffrey. The man could barely string 2 sentences together on his own, but he had the